The Keeper of Maps, a Walter Bramble story. Chapter 1. The Atlas on the Shelf. It had rained all morning and was threatening to rain again. Walter Bramble stood at his kitchen window with a cup of tea that had gone slightly cold and watched a wood pigeon make a series of poor decisions on the garden fence. The pigeon kept shuffling to the left, then shuffling back, then tilting its head at the garden as though reconsidering a life choice. Walter understood completely. He rinsed the cup, put on his coat, and decided he would go to the library. This was not an unusual decision. Walter went to the library most Tuesdays and sometimes on Thursdays, and occasionally on a Wednesday if there was nothing particular on the radio. The library was 5 minutes from his house along Orchard Lane and then left onto the High Street, and if he went the slightly longer way past the church, he could look at the old lich gate, which he was fond of. It was 12 minutes that way. He usually went the longer way. The lich gate was looking very well in the damp. The old timber had darkened, and the stone beneath it had a greenish tinge, the kind of colour you only get from years of rain and moss and patient English weather. Walter stopped and put his hand against one of the uprights. It was cold and slightly rough and very solid. He had taught English literature for 31 years at the secondary school on the other side of town. He had spent those years trying to give teenagers some sense of what words were for. Some of them had listened. More of them than you would think, actually. He occasionally received letters. He went on to the library. Mrs. Finch was behind the desk when he came in, as she generally was. She was a small woman with a tidy grey bob and reading glasses she wore on a cord around her neck, and she had the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades among books and found it entirely sufficient. "Morning, Mr. Bramble," she said, without looking up from whatever she was cataloguing. "Good morning, Mrs. Finch." He took his coat off and hung it on the stand by the door, which was where you were supposed to hang it, and went through to the main room. The library smelled the way libraries smell when they have been libraries for a long time. It was partly old paper and partly something harder to name, something like the residue of all the people who had sat in this room reading things that mattered to them. Walter had always found it settling, better than most smells he could think of. He walked along the back wall, which was where they kept the older stock, the things that had been donated over the years or had simply outlasted their own moment of popularity. There were travel books from the 1950s, a great many books on flower arranging, several histories of small English counties that no longer seemed to have anyone particularly interested in them. He was looking, though he could not have said exactly what he was looking for. This was often how it went. He would walk along the shelves with his hands behind his back, tilting his head slightly to read the spines, and something would present itself. What presented itself today was large and green and very old. It was on the second shelf from the bottom, lying flat rather than standing upright because it was too large to stand. The spine read, "An Atlas of the British Isles and Selected Territories, compiled by Edmund R. Harley, 1887. Walter bent down and slid it out carefully. It was heavy. He carried it to one of the reading tables near the window and set it down and opened it. The pages were thick and cream-coloured, and the maps themselves were hand-engraved, the lines so fine they seemed almost like something the page had grown, rather than something someone had drawn on it. The ink had browned slightly at the edges of the coastlines. The North Sea was labelled in careful italic script. There were depth soundings in fathoms. There were small symbols indicating sandbars and shipping lanes and areas of known treacherous current. He turned pages slowly. There was a map of the Thames estuary that showed Essex in a way he had never quite seen before. The marshes were there, the great flat pale expanses, and the creeks running in from the sea like cracks in old plaster. Mercia Island, Osier Island, the mouth of the Blackwater, wide and brown. He put his fingertip very gently on the Blackwater. The ink was cool beneath his finger. Or perhaps it was not ink so much as something else. He sat for a moment, not moving, with his finger on the old map and the rain starting again against the library windows. And something began to shift at the edges of things, the way the quality of light changes before you realize why. He blinked. The smell of the library had changed. There was salt in it now, and something else, something low and ancient. The smell of tidal mud when the water pulls back and leaves the world exposed. Walter Bramble sat very still and let it come. Chapter 2. The Man with the Oilskin. He was standing on a sea wall. It was not a grand sea wall. It was the kind of sea wall that gets built because the land is flat and the sea is not especially trustworthy, a long, low bank of earth and clay with rough grass growing on top of it and a wooden stake every few yards going slightly rotten. The path along the top of it was narrow. To his left, inland, the fields went on for a very long way under a grey and considerable sky. To his right, the estuary lay open, the water gunmetal grey and moving in the particular restless way of tidal water that cannot quite make up its mind. It was cold. Not savagely cold, but the kind of cold that has been there a while and has settled in and has no particular plans to leave. There was a wind coming off the water that smelled strongly of salt, and underneath that, of things that live at the bottom of things. Walter turned up the collar of his coat. He noticed the coat was slightly different from his usual one, heavier, with a tarred smell to it. He did not dwell on this. A heron was standing at the edge of the water below the wall, enormously patient and grey, one leg slightly raised. It looked at Walter. Walter looked at it. They reached an understanding and went on existing beside each other. He walked along the wall. There was nowhere else obviously to go, and walking seemed right. The grass on top of the wall was wet and the path was muddy in the low places between the stakes, and he had to watch where he put his feet. This was good. Watching where you put your feet keeps you in the present, which is where you want to be when the present is somewhere like this. After a while he saw a figure ahead of him on the wall. The figure was a man, old and very thin, wearing an oilskin coat that reached to his ankles. He was walking slowly in the same direction Walter was walking, with a bag over one shoulder, and he was looking out at the water the way you look at something you have looked at every day for most of your life. Walter caught up to him gradually. The man did not turn around. He seemed to know someone was there and did not particularly mind. "Good morning," Walter said when he was close enough. The old man looked at him sideways. He had a long face and pale eyes the same colour as the water, and he was clean-shaven in the precise and deliberate way of a man who takes some pride in it. "Passable," he said, "for March." "Are you a local man?" Walter asked, because it seemed the right question, and because he could not think what else to ask, and because this man clearly knew this place in a way that went right through him. "Born and died here," the man said. "More or less." Walter walked alongside him. They went on for a while without speaking, and this did not seem to require apology on either side. The estuary widened gradually as they walked, the far shore a thin, dark line of trees with the sky above it going pale. An oyster-catcher went past very fast, calling once, a sharp, bright sound that disappeared into the wind. "My father kept maps," the old man said at some point. "Not for navigation, just for looking at. He said a good map was proof that someone had paid attention." Walter thought about this. He thought about the atlas, the fine engraved lines, the italic lettering over the estuary, the care in it. He was right, Walter said. He generally was. It annoyed people. They came around a slight bend in the wall, and a creek opened up to their left, cutting inland through the marsh. The mud at its edges was extraordinary, dark and gleaming, and the grass on the marsh was a very particular pale green, the colour of things that have adapted to being occasionally under water and have made their peace with it. There was a boat pulled up on the mud at the edge of the creek, a flat-bottomed thing, wooden, painted once in red and now merely reddish. A name had been painted on the bow in white letters. Patience. "Yours?" Walter asked. The old man made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite denial. "Used to go out in it," he said. "Mostly just to sit. The water is very quiet in the middle of the estuary. People do not understand how quiet it can be." Walter looked at the little red boat in the mud. He thought about sitting in a boat called Patience in the middle of a grey estuary with nothing to do but be there. It seemed to him a very good thing to do. The wind had eased a little, or perhaps he had simply stopped noticing it. The marsh grasses rustled and the water moved, and the heron, which had somehow reappeared further along the creek, stood in exactly the same position as before, as if it had never moved at all, or as if moving was something herons did only reluctantly and under extreme circumstances. "There used to be a chart of this creek on the wall of my father's house," the old man said. "Showed every bend, every depth, where the mud was soft enough to be dangerous. He had drawn it himself over years, little notes in the margins, where he had seen certain birds, where the samphire grew thickest, that sort of thing." "What happened to it?" The old man did not answer immediately. He looked out at the creek where it bent away into the marsh and was lost. "Still there," he said finally, "as far as I know." They walked on. The sea wall went on ahead of them in a long curve, always roughly the same. The grass and the stakes and the mud and the water and the enormous pale sky that seemed to contain everything here, to be the main fact of the place. Walter felt the cold in his face and the slight heaviness of the borrowed coat and the give of the path under his feet, and he thought, as he sometimes did in this kind of half-dreaming state, of Margaret. Not with sadness exactly, or not only with sadness, with the particular quality of feeling that comes from loving someone for 38 years and then continuing to love them after, when there is nowhere for it to go except sideways into everything else, into the sound of the oyster-catcher, into the color of the water, into the fine engraved lines of an old map. He walked. The man in the oilskin walked beside him and said nothing more, and this was fine. This was, in fact, exactly right. Chapter 3. What the mapmaker knew. The light was changing. Walter had not noticed it happening, but it had been happening for some time, the way things do when you are not watching. The grey of the sky had deepened towards the west, where the sun would be going down behind clouds, and the water of the estuary had taken on a pewter colour, almost metallic, and the marsh grasses had gone still in the way they go still when the wind drops and the evening begins to think seriously about itself. The old man had stopped walking. He was standing at a gap in the sea wall where a rough set of wooden steps went down onto the marsh, and he was looking inland along a path that ran across the marsh towards a group of buildings perhaps a quarter of a mile away. Low buildings, dark with age, a reed-thatched roof that had seen many years, a light showing in one window. "That is the farm," the old man said. He did not say which farm. He said it the way you say that is the farm when there is only one farm that matters. Walter looked at the path across the marsh. In the failing light, the mud on either side of it gleamed faintly. "You should walk carefully," the old man said. "On the path. Keep to the middle." "The mud?" "Deep," the old man said, with a particular brevity that suggested this was not hypothetical information. Walter went down the steps. They creaked under him, and the bottom step was missing, so he had to step down further than expected, and his foot sank very slightly into the soft ground, and there was a smell of extraordinary richness, of ancient silt and salt, and the long patience of tidal places. He walked. He kept to the middle of the path. The marsh was very quiet now. The sort of quiet that is not empty but full of the small sounds of water in the creeks, and the far-off calling of some bird he could not identify, and the faint suck and give of the mud when something moved in it. He reached the farm. Up close it was smaller than it had looked from the sea wall, or perhaps just lower, as though it had settled over the years into the land around it and become part of it. The thatch was dark with moisture, and there were lichen on the walls, and the yard in front of the house was cobbled with small round stones that were slippery and green in the damp. The door was open. He did not knock exactly, but he stopped in the doorway and waited. Inside was a low room with a stone floor and a fireplace that was doing its best with what appeared to be very damp wood. The light came from a lamp on a table, and from the fire, and from nowhere else. A woman was sitting at the table. She was perhaps 70, with white hair pinned up loosely, and a shawl around her shoulders and hands that had clearly done a great deal of work over a long time, and were resting now. On the table in front of her was a large sheet of paper. She had been drawing on it. She looked up at Walter in the doorway without particular surprise. "Come in," she said. "You will let the warmth out." He came in. He stood near the fire and looked at the paper on the table. It was a map. It showed the creek and the sea wall and the marsh in considerable detail, the lines drawn in pencil with a confident hand. She was adding to it as he watched, her pencil moving along what must have been the path he had just walked. "Did you come from James?" she asked, without looking up. Walter considered. He thought of the man in the oilskin, the pale eyes, the economy of speech. "I walked with him for a while," Walter said, On the wall. She made a small sound of satisfaction. He still walks it, she said. I like to think about that. I am too old for the wall now. My knees. She tapped her left knee gently with the pencil. But James still walks it. I think he always will. Walter sat down carefully in a chair near the fire. It was a very old chair with a cushion that had subsided into itself over the years and become something more like a suggestion than a cushion. He sat in it and let the fire work on his face and looked at the woman drawing her map. She was adding notes in the margins. He could not read them from where he sat. "What are the notes?" he asked. She paused and looked at what she'd written. "This one says where the redshank nest in spring. This one is about the samphire. You can pick it from late June, but not before. Not if you want it to come back next year." She touched the pencil to a spot near the edge of the creek. "This one is about my husband. He found a curlew egg here once. Only the once. He kept the shell his whole life." Walter looked at the fire. A piece of the damp wood shifted and the flame changed colour briefly, going orange and then settling again. "A map like that is a different kind of thing," he said, "from the ones in atlases." "Of course it is," she said, as though this were obvious. "An atlas tells you where things are. A map like this tells you what it was like to be there." She went on drawing. Walter sat in the old chair, and the fire burned down slightly, and he thought about that distinction. What it tells you versus what it was like. He thought about Edmund R. Harley, whoever he had been, ruling his fine lines across cream paper in 1887, and he thought about this woman in this room adding a note about a curlew egg at the edge of a marsh creek. Both true. Both necessary. The room was warm now, or warm enough. Outside the wind had come back slightly, and he could hear it in the reed thatch, a low rushing sound that was not unpleasant. Somewhere out on the marsh a bird was calling, the same bird he had heard on the path, and he still could not identify it, and it did not particularly matter. He was very tired in the good way, the way you are when you have been outside in cold air and walked a long way and sat down near a fire. His eyes grew heavy. The woman was still drawing. Her pencil moved in small, careful strokes. She was humming something very quietly, barely audible, the kind of thing you hum when you're absorbed in a thing and the sound is just for company. Walter could not make out what it was. Something old, he thought. Something that had been around long enough to wear smooth. He let his eyes close. The fire, the pencil, the wind in the thatch, the bird out on the marsh, calling once more and then not calling. He thought about the atlas in the library, the way it had lain flat on the shelf because it was too large to stand, waiting to be found. He thought about Edmund Harley's fine engraved lines, the depth soundings in fathoms, the italic script over the estuary. He thought about the man in the oilskin and the boat called Patience sitting in the mud. He thought about Margaret. He thought for a moment about the library on a rainy Tuesday morning, the smell of it, Mrs. Finch at her desk, the coat on the stand by the door. These things were not very far apart, he thought, the library and the marsh, the atlas and the woman's penciled notes, the map of where things are and the map of what it was like to be there. They were different versions of the same thing. Which was, he thought, just before the warmth took him entirely, attention. Someone, somewhere, paying attention. He slept. He woke in his own chair, in his own sitting room, with the atlas closed on his lap and the rain against the window, and the light, the particular flat grey of a November afternoon that has been grey since before you got up and will remain grey until it is simply dark instead. He sat for a while without moving. Then he got up and went to his desk and found a notebook and a pencil, and sat back down and opened the notebook to a blank page, and thought for a moment about what to write. He wrote, "The marsh, the smell of it, the heron that was always in the same place." He wrote, "The woman's notes in the margin, the curlew egg." He sat looking at what he had written. Outside the rain went on. The wood pigeon had come back to the fence and was looking at the garden again with the same expression of mild philosophical uncertainty. Walter Bramble picked up his pencil and kept writing.